We could start by taking a sort of an overview of the scene and give everyone some context here. You were kind of flying blind. I kind of threw this at you. I didn't tell you anything about the characters, the story, nothing. That was on purpose.
Yeah, and that was great. It is. I actually think, I think approaching a document when we're doing what we're doing, where we're like trying to like get what the dialogue is doing in the script. I think approaching a document with no background gives reader first impressions, right?
Yeah.
Like it's just like the reader reading it for the first time, which is what we want. Like we want to see like, okay, what does our reader see? So I was happy to not have any because I got to see it like a reader would see it for the first time.
Cool.
And as we get started, I do just have to say that like, thank you for letting me read the document. Because I've been following all your podcasts, The Career Author and the Writers Inc. is amazing, and I love everything you do, and I feel like you're a mentor to me in a way that like even though this is the first time, like one of the first times we've talked on face to face, but we're not really on camera. So all that to say, I really appreciated you giving me the document, and even though I didn't know anything about it, like I knew, well, Jay's going to crush the plot. Like the story is going to be solid and it's going to be great. And and so I was just really happy to be able to contribute because
Thank you, man.
It was fun.
Well,
yeah, absolutely.
Well, you really you did a fantastic job, and we're going to get into that in detail. So I'm excited to kind of hear a little bit more because we haven't talked about this yet. I read your comments, but this will be the first time we're talking about it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's awesome. So did you want to give some background to to everybody listening just so they know what we're getting into?
Yeah, just kind of set it up. This is going to be the first chapter of a manuscript that I'm working on, and it's pretty big in scope. I'm not going to get into the writerly details, but I'll just say that it's essentially a scene where two characters meet for the first time. One of them is the host of a reality game show, and another one is a contestant who has been chosen to be on it. And my goal in this opening scene is to hook the reader by putting a big twist right in the middle of the scene, where they think it's going to be sort of like an abduction interrogation scene, and it flips into the beginning of a reality game show. What was important for me as far as the dialogue goes, this is another important thing to mention. J.D. Barker is mentoring me on this project, and his suggestion was to write my entire first draft as dialogue only, so that I get the characters ringing true, so that there's authentic pacing, especially when you're looking at television, Hollywood, big screen, little screen. The dialogue first really matters. So it's not written like a movie script because I didn't use the proper formatting, but I put the camera on my shoulder and I filmed what was in my head, and I got that on the paper. So what we're looking at here is just a very short, like 800 word or so, mostly dialogue exchange between these two men. And what I was really trying to do was establish the power dynamic between them, because that is going to play out through the rest of the story.
Yeah, and that's great. And you totally nailed it. It
Cool.
was, and the flip, I love so just to talk about the plot structure that you described a second ago, because I'm reading 3-Story Method and learning about plot, which is, that we could talk about that for like hours, how great that is. But that flip in the middle is so, and we'll look at it in a second, but it's so great because even the voices change and like the presentation of the character changes. Like it's just really, really great. The scene is a really strong and really great scene. So
Good,
I really liked it. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's dig into it. Let's get in.
Let's pull it up here.
Yeah.
And take a look.
Awesome. Okay. So let's look at that first exchange. So, and just to give you a little bit of my process and what I do when I'm editing something like this is I'm going to read the first back and forth between characters. So right away, you have two characters set up. You got Harker and Sands. And Harker's the guy tied to the chair. And Sands is at first kind of a person you may not see, just a voice, right? And
correct.
So it's this really compelling setting right off the bat. which is great. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to read the first back and forth and get my first impressions of the character. And then before I make any edits or any like make any comments or any thoughts, I'm going to read the rest of the script to see if my first impressions match what you were going for with the characters. Because that first impression is like so important. It's like when we meet people for the first time, if you make a terrible first impression, it's very difficult to overcome over time. And it's the same when we meet our characters for the first time in dialogue. When we hear them speak for the first time, we get that like sense of who they are and what they see their own position in the world, because so much is communicated through words. I was actually thinking about this morning, that like how powerful words are, in that like most religious traditions start with some form of deity speaking things into existence. And that's it's so our communication and how we talk and the words we use and our tone and our pacing and it all makes up our presentation of ourselves to the world. So that being said, that first impression of two characters talking to each other is really important, especially when those two characters are going to be kind of protagonist, antagonist, right? Yes. Like you want the Batman Joker exchange to be this like massive interaction that like sets some themes and some tones. And so all of that saying, like, read the first, when I edit a script, I read the first impression. And then before I comment or do anything, even in my own work, I go and I read the rest of the scene to make sure that first impression lines up. So let's look at that first scene. Originally you wrote Sans saying, "Don't say a word, not a solitary word, solitary syllable." And then Harker replies, "The ties are hurting my wrists, man." And then Sans says back, "I said to shut up, shut your mouth." So there's a couple things I see right away that I love. The first thing is this repeated words from Sans, right? This like saying the same thing over and over again. And when we in dialogue repeat words, it heightens emotion, whatever that emotion is. So if you're angry, you can be like Robert De Niro in the one where he's Al Capone. Why is the name of that slipping my mind? It's one of my favorite movies. But he finds out that he's been like busted by the FBI, and he's like, "I want him dead. I want his family dead. I want his house burned to the ground." Right. Like it's this great scene where he's just like yelling over and over again about killing the guy. And it's that like repeated phrasing, short, stopping, pounding of words that really creates that like heightened anger.
Yeah.
Or on the other side, what comes to mind is like Michael Scott in The Office finding out that like Holly, his true love, is single, right? Like she's been gone, she comes back, she finds, so he just comes running into the office, he's like, happy, 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 right? Like it's this like, but it's that repeated like machine gun style words that like heighten emotion. So the first thing I thought was like, okay, it feels to me like Sans is angry. And like Sans is like repeating these gunshot style words. So that's my first impression of Sans. My first impression of Harker, where he says the ties are hurting my wrists, man, adding that man creates this kind of laid back side to Harker, right? Like there's clearly some like casualness to him, especially since it's in such contrast to his setting, right? Like he's tied to a chair, he's in darkness besides this little light. The implication is that he can't see anything around him. So like to be that casual speaks a lot about who he is as a character. Right out of the first words out of his mouth. We also get this like really strong, and I really like the contrast you created here where Sans is saying like, don't say a word, and then Harker immediately speaks. So there's like this like anti-authoritarian stream to Harker, this kind of like screw the man type thing, which is great as well. So that was my first impression, right? You've got an angry man that's in a position of power, and then this kind of casual anti-authoritarian tied to a chair. Then I went through and I read the rest of the script, and I saw that Sans, I was actually misreading Sans, and that Sans isn't angry. He's more professional and businesslike and very much the person in control of the scene.
Yes.
Right. Like he is boss in the scene. So, so what I did was I came through and I left Harker because the first impression of Harker is spot on. He keeps that like casual, anti-authoritarian, very young sounding voice. So didn't touch his line, but I changed both of Sands's. So Sands, instead of saying don't say a word, not a solitary word, solitary syllable, I changed it just to don't speak.
Mm-hmm.
Because the shortness of the phrasing and the command of it communicates this is a man who's in charge and doesn't have time to be bothered with.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And then we get that the ties are hurting my wrists, man. And then you get Sands coming back, and here I actually expanded what Sands said, because if we're going to play this power dynamic that you've written really beautiful into the script, we need Sands responding to challenges to his power, which gets this great dynamic between Sands and Harker, where Harker is just naturally going to be anti-authoritarian. It's who he is, right? Like, he's not going to sit there quietly. He's not just going to take this, right? But at the same time, it's not going to rile him. He's not getting angry, right? Like, he's in this, and he's accepting of his circumstances, but at the same time pushing back on them. But you have, in contrast to him with Sands, you've got this business-like guy who's a boss, who's professional, who's trying to control the scene. So if Harker speaks, Sands has to reply, right? Like, it's got to come, he's got to speak back. So I expanded what Sands said, and I built it out a little bit more. And I changed from, I said to shut up, shut your mouth. I wanted to keep the content you have, because the content is great, but pull back that anger. And instead, I have him saying, it's in your best interest to listen to me when I give you instructions. If I say don't speak, that means I don't want to hear a single solitary syllable. And also bringing back that, like, I really liked that alliteration you had in that first thing. So bringing that back into the bottom, where, like, now Sands is going to open up a little bit more and speak more. Like, he's going to give more words. Because if we had gotten to this scene, like, going the other direction, let's say that Harker was mousy, right? And Sands said, don't speak. And Harker sat in silence. Sands probably wouldn't say anything else, right? Like, because he's getting his way, he's in charge. So it's that, like, and so the goal here is to have this really great first impression of both characters that contrasts the both of them, with Sands using longer words, which speaks to kind of his education and the idea that he's accustomed to being in power. People
a bit of smugness, right? I mean, he's kind of smug.
Yeah, smug, and not suffering of fools.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I just don't have time for some stupid kid that it clearly is tied to a chair, right? Like, so you get this great contrast. But those were my thoughts and edits on the first scene. So we get the ending result is this: don't speak. The ties are hurting my wrists, man. It's in your best interest to listen to me when I give you instructions. If I say don't speak, that means I don't want to hear a single solitary syllable, right? And you get this, like, great. So already, just from the first three, the first exchange, the first three lines, we start to get this tension between these two characters that's really nice and strong, and I feel like very engaging and compelling, and also feels realistic, like, because we want our dialogue, there's two things that I kind of shoot for whenever I'm editing dialogue, and one thing is realism, right? Like, we don't want the reader being broken away because something feels unrealistic. So we want them captivated by the dialogue so that it feels like something they would hear two people actually say. And then at the same time, we want it to be super engaging, which is different than realistic dialogue, because realistic dialogue is sometimes mundane, boring, and, like, so
fragments of sentences and random words, right?
Going back and forth. Like, I'm sure if somebody were to transcribe me talking, they'd be like, he talks so much. Just like, so we want it to be engaging and entertaining. So it's not real dialogue. It is entertainment, but it needs to feel real at the same time. And I feel like this dialogue that we have here, combined with the setting that you've put it in, it creates this really beautiful, mysterious, like, oh, I want to know more of what's going on.
Okay.
Yeah. So moving on to the second exchange, This one's a little bit longer, but we get Sans saying, we know how desperate we are. We have scoured your financials and talked to your employer. So I took that line. Well, and let me give the pairing. I think it'll be better if I give the pairing. So Sans says, actually, I won't give the pairing yet. I lied. So Sans, let me go back. Sans says, we know how desperate you are. We've scoured your financials. We've talked to your employer. He's making a case, right? Clearly he's making a case for like, hey, this is why you're here. Let me explain what's going on. And this comes from a really interesting book when it comes to dialogue. It can be controversial when it comes to social economic status, but when it comes to how people talk, it's really interesting. It's called How Poverty Works. Really interesting book. And what it does is it gives characteristics of people in different social economic statuses. And part of what it says is that people who have education and power, who have been in power for a long amount of time, understand how to make a case and have a direction in storytelling. So they tend to start at the beginning of the story, they then tell the middle of the story, they tell the end of story. People who haven't grown up with education tend to skip to the most exciting part first.
Interesting.
Right? And these are like big generalizations. Which are terrible for social sciences, fantastic for dialogue writers, right? Like great for us. But so because it gives us things to play with and contrast. But so we know Sans already to be this business person who's in control. So we want to have him make a case like he's made 1,000 cases in boardrooms or 1,000 cases to people under him. Like this is a guy used to getting his way. So he's going to build his case first and then make his point. And so we have in the way it was originally written, we know how desperate you are. That's his point.
Yeah.
Right. We've scoured your financials. We've talked to your employer. So a guy like Sans, we want to flip that. So we say, we've scoured your financials and we've talked to your employer. We know how desperate you are. Right. So he's like building the case, landing the point because he doesn't have time again to like deal with this young college-ish like upstart.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was the first edit in the second section, and then we get into this really great moment where you have Harker just saying, "I didn't give," right, and the assumption is, "I didn't give you permission to do whatever it is you did," but Sans immediately cuts him off, which is great because it's this like it's playing into that great power dynamic already. And just to point out, like, there's so much we can do with dialogue.
Yeah,
right? Like we've had no setting description. We've had no adjectives that describe how either of these people are talking, but just with the words they say, we can create this like beautiful character sketch of who they are.
Yeah.
Right. It's very, it's part of what I love about reading Hemingway. Right. People always talk about how simple Hemingway is, but part of the genius of Hemingway is that he can just have these back and forth exchanges, sometimes between like 3 or 4 characters, and you know exactly who each character is just by the words they're using, right? Like in the way they talk to each other.
And that's exactly what JD told me. He's like, I should be able to tell your character just from their speech. That's all. I should be able to identify them from every other character based on how they talk.
Yeah, and when we can pull that off as a writer, it's fantastic because we get this super easy to read, incredibly smooth book that people just roll through and they want the next one because they fall in love with the characters. They put the words in their mouths, like it's there. They start to own these characters, and it's just it's really great because they engage in the realism of the dialogue and are entertained by the engaging aspect of it.
Right.
Yeah. So we have him saying, Harker saying, "I didn't give," and then we have Sans replying, "You didn't need to. Don't you understand how much personal data can be scraped off the internet these days? You really should be more careful when you place orders from your smartphone." So again, you did this really great thing in the manuscript where you've got Sans jabbing at Harker, right? Like he pokes him twice, and that one time is don't you understand how much personal data can be scraped off the internet? And then the second poke is, you really should be more careful. But a guy like Sans that we've set up doesn't need to poke him twice. right? And doesn't need to rub anything in his face because Sans has nothing to win or lose here. Right? Like, he's already in charge. He already has the power. And this is more for him about the words coming out of his mouth are more about an expression of authority. And he clearly, we're seeing now that he has a plan, right? He's going somewhere. So there's not a lot of time to screw with this kid, right? Like, he's just moving forward. So I edited the dialogue a little bit to have Harker say, I didn't give, left that just how it was, because the interruption is great, and him just pushing back again, that like anti-authoritarian, I'm not going to take your crap, man, stuff. And then I have Sans coming back and saying, you didn't need to. A lot of personal data can be scraped off the internet. You really should just be more careful when you place orders on your smartphone. And it gives that like kind of smug,
condescending kind of
like
tone.
you know, look, you screwed up and you've put yourself here. Right, like you get that, like, I don't need to jab at you, I don't need to poke at you because you've done this to yourself.
Right.
And then we have an interesting and really good move from Harker, and where he says, okay, then what happens next, in the original script. And this is something I'm so guilty of, and I try to beat out of my writing all the time. And I think we all are, because we're so like plot focused, and we're so like, I need to move the story forward, that in dialogue, a lot of times I'll become C-3PO from Star Wars, where I'm like telling everybody what happened. Like, you know, oh, it's the Jawas. They take robots apart and they're here to move us forward. Like, you know, and it's that like plot telling through dialogue.
Yeah.
When a lot of times we can just let the dialogue do its work, and cut things that, like, so anytime I find myself plot telling, I just cut. And it's like, if the reader can't figure out where the plot's going, then there's a problem with my plot. Like, there's that. So the characters don't need to tell the reader what happens next. If the reader can't figure out what happens next by just getting there, then like I need to go back and rejigger my story structure.
Right.
So I just deleted that what happens next.
Yep. So
his reply is just, okay then. Right, so you get this, you know, you really should be more careful about what orders you place from your smartphone. And Harker can't leave it, right? It's not in his nature to leave it. So he's going to be like, okay, then.
Yeah.
And then coming back, we get this moment where Sans is going to take back control, right? And because Harker, this okay then is a pushback again. Like, it's a gentle pushback. It's not a like firm, hard attack, but it is this like gentle ease back. Mm-hmm. So Sans originally comes back and says, my assistants will remove the blindfold as well as sever the zip ties around your wrists. I'm assuming you understand the consequences if you do not comply with these rules. And then we have Harker saying, yeah, I get it. Just get the damn stuff off of me. Again, the Harker voice is great. Yeah, I get it. Just get the damn stuff off of me. That's 100% Harker. Like, you can feel him saying that tied to a chair. It still has that casual nature, expressing some irritation, but not in like I'm desperate to get out of this, right? Like, just right. I want this off of me, but I'm not going to give you, in that anti-authoritarian bent, I'm not going to give you the satisfaction of seeing that I'm really struggling.
Yep.
So, but the voice of Sans becomes a little more technical here in the original, right? So just pulling it back, in a moment, my assistant is going to remove your blindfold and cut you loose. I'm trusting you understand the consequences if you do not comply with our rules, right? So the threat doesn't need to be a question, right? He can just say it.
Yeah.
Because what he says is law for him. So like this, he is the all-controlling force in the scene, at least he wants to be.
So he wouldn't even allow an answer because that might challenge his authority. So he wouldn't even ask the question.
Yeah, and you can imagine, like, what is Sans, and this is something I like to do with characters, is just go, what does this character want this conversation to be? Right, like, because Harker is clearly, the way you've written the scene in this really great, like, back and forth with each other, is Sans clearly wants Harker to say, hey, look, don't speak. here's what's going to happen. We know everything about you already. So there's no need to deny anything. In a second, I'm going to cut you loose and we're going to ask you to do something. And that's clearly all Sans wants to say, but he's got this guy tied to this chair who keeps like kicking back on him.
Yeah.
And so he's having to explain himself already more than he wants. But you can almost, what I was going for with that last line is that like Sans has a script, right? Like he's got a plan. Whether he's done this before or not, who knows? But he's got a plan for how this conversation is going to go and what's going to happen next. And he really just needs Harker to follow the plan.
Yep.
And Harker keeps inserting his voice into this controlling moment, which I think is great, but we have to keep Sans coming back to his like, I'm in charge. So like just keep reasserting. So then the next exchange, the third exchange, we have the next two lines I thought were great, and I left them just how they were, right? Sans says, stand up and face the back wall, which is perfect Sans, right in the voice of Sans. And then Harker says, give me a second to get the blood flowing again, would you? My leg is cramping, which is also perfect Harker, right? Because like, not like you've had me tied to this chair, not like, what is going on? Not like, I don't like this, not like, you can't tell me what to do. Well, I got a leg cramp, right? Like playing down everything happening.
Yeah.
And then originally you had Sans just moving forward with the conversation. You're going to make the most difficult decision of your life and like taking the next step in the story. But I couldn't see Sans letting that go. Like Sans isn't going to he's not going to let this punk tell him that he's got a leg cramp, right? Like, because now you're pushing, this is the third exchange and it's the third major, like, set of back and forths, and in that third one we need Sans to like react a little bit, because now Harker's pushing on him. So I just gave Sans an extra line. I said, stand up and face the back wall, right? Like still succinct, to the point. I have a plan, you're going to follow my plan, but at the same time bringing in that a little bit, like starting to edge in that irritation in his words a little bit.
It's almost like a parent who's said the same thing to a kid and he's like, I said.
I said, put your nose in the corner, right? Like, what parent? That's horrible parenting. So anyway, maybe not. I don't know. Maybe the kid deserves to have his nose in the corner. But yeah, it's that like, this is what I told you to do. And I liked how you have this here, this like, him pushing back on what Sans can go all the way back to the first exchange. Like it's reminiscent of their first exchange where Sans is like, don't speak.
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm going to speak.
Yeah.
And Sans is like, when I tell you to do something, you do it.
Yeah.
Right. Like now we're getting the fulfillment of that where he's like, stand up and face the back wall. He's like, hold on, my leg's cramping. I said, stand up and face the back wall. And like, we've already started to establish a theme that these two are going to have power struggle.
Yeah.
Right now, whether that theme plays through the rest of the manuscript or not is kind of where you want to take that plot and the themes of the story. But it's possible to have that here, which is great to have like potential and possibility in your opening scene to kind of go in multiple directions.
Cool.
Yeah. And so then I had to give Harker a response because Harker's not going to follow instructions. So I just added this line for Harker: fine, man, I'm going, just give me a second. Right? Like, and again, we get that, like, I'm going to do what you say, but I'm also not going to do it right away. Like, so that, like, kind of playing back and forth. The next line we had was Sans saying, like, now setting the stage for this whole thing that's happening. And originally we had, you're going to make the most difficult decision of your life. 3 doors face you, each one identical in color and shape. One of these doors leads to a brighter future. The other 2 do not. You will have 60 seconds to make this decision. And then Harker saying, my entire life comes down to one lucky decision, which is a great exchange. I didn't really change a lot of Sans's lines. I just edited it to match his pacing a little bit. Yes. So Sans is going to, I left all of the great content there with Sans just pushing forward with his plan, right? You're about to make the most difficult decision of your life. 3 doors face you, each one identical in color and shape. One door leads to a brighter future. The other 2 do not. You will have 60 seconds to make your decision, right? Like, so great, like great pacing, great Sans moment. No like real edits for that.
Okay.
But the next line for Harker, I read it and I thought to myself, like, why would Harker say that? My entire life comes down to one lucky decision. And because it's the first time he hasn't pushed back, right? Like, now he's actually engaging in what's happening. And he's doing so in a way that he's asking a non-question. And so that's a really weird thing in dialogue that we do. It's very realistic. It's something that we all do, where we want elaboration. So we reflect back on the moment that's happening because we want to know more, right? And that's what it felt to me like Harker was doing.
Yeah.
He's taking what Sam said and he's like just giving it back to him in this hope to like get a little bit more out of him. And so after hearing that, I was like, oh, he's stalling, right? Like, and so let's let him stall. Like, let's like build that out a little bit. So I gave Harker just some more words there to like beef out the words, because, you know, when we're writing dialogue, there's only a couple things. We only have so many tools. We have like the word choice. Are they using small words or big words? Is it like, you know, complex, minuscule, or is it little and big? Right? Like the word choice we're using. We have the amount of words they use. And then we have like the structure they put those words in.
Right.
And so those are kind of our 3 tools that we play with when we're building out dialogue. And so thus far, Harker's been very like casual and very anti-authoritarian, but also very to the point. Right? Like, he hasn't really had a paragraph yet. So if he's stalling, let's let the reader feel it. Let's let the reader like feel like, oh, something's changed in the way he's talking right now. So he's looking for something. So I just built him out a little bit. You're telling me that my whole life comes down to which door I pick, and you're not going to give me any more information. I just pick one and hope I get lucky. Right? So it's this re-saying everything Sans has said, and really, I hope, makes the reader feel like he's stalling. He doesn't want to pick a door yet.
Yeah.
Right. And you almost get that visual image of him in his mind as he's talking, examining all 3 doors.
Yep.
Like trying to figure out, like, is something happening here that I need to see that I'm not catching? Is there some kind of clue? And of course, in the next exchange, Sans is going to give him nothing. Right? Your life will be set in motion. Sans says, your life was set in motion long before now. You should have been more fiscally responsible, Mr. Harker. And then Harker says, I paid my bills, most of them. That's such a beautiful, I paid my bills, most of them. And I feel like every reader in the world is going to relate to that. Because we all think like, hey, I'm a good person, I pay my bills. And then you have to pause and be like, okay, most of my bills.
Almost all of them.
Yeah, almost, you know. Yeah, I think I did.
Yeah.
So it's that great, like, makes Harker super relatable there. And then the last 2 exchanges, and I'm going to put all 4 of these together.
Yeah.
The last 2, Sans says, if that was true, you would not be standing before me this evening, finding yourself in this dire predicament. And then you have Harker saying, okay. And then you have Sans saying, your 60 seconds begins now. So what I did was I took that 4 piece back and forth, and I made it into 3. And going backwards to forwards, the okay, your 60 seconds begins now, I didn't feel like Sans was actually going to give Harker the opportunity to say okay. Right? Like, he's on a path, and he's got a plan, and he's executing at this point. And Harker has been told what to do, right? And like at the beginning, when I tell you something, you're going to do it, right? Put your back against the wall. I said, put your back against the wall. You have 60 seconds. He's not going to like pause to give him a chance to respond. He's just like, you have 60 seconds and it starts right now. So I pulled the okay, and I just made it, if that were true, you wouldn't be here. Your 60 seconds starts now. Right? Yeah. So we take Sans's response to Harker and we just push it in with his plan and push that together. And then I rearranged did I read? I didn't. So then the three-part exchange becomes, you've had plenty of opportunity to make informed choices, Mr. Harker. You should have been more fiscally responsible. I paid my bills, most of them. If that were true, you wouldn't be here. Your 60 seconds starts now. Right? And it gives this huge, amazing, like, pivot point to the next scene, like massive choice he's got to make, which is, you know, part of what you're so great about it with as a storyteller is laying out that plot and like forcing the characters into this moment of decision.
Mm-hmm.
And so like that your 60 seconds begins now makes the reader feel like, oh crap, like no more stalling, there's no more talking.
Stalling, yeah,
he's got to pick a door, right?
Yep.
Like it's such a great moment. So, and I'm going to skip down because the rest of it, what moved forward, I didn't have any like edits that I think people would really like get a lot from. Like we could talk about like, you know, me moving words around, but that's really just pushing words around the page. The next big moment comes. So what happens is we get this introduction where he picks a door and he walks through it. And then everything becomes kind of like a reality game show.
Yes.
And there's a voiceover introducing that this is this show, BioCave, and the first contestant of this group that's called the B8, and the you know, and that Sans is now introduced as the host of the BioCave. And so we get down to Sans introducing everyone. And you had originally you had Sans saying, and so sorry, before we get into that, there's this beautiful transformation that happens in Sans here where he changes persona from private to public, right? And as writers, part of what we do, and I think a lot of us do it unconsciously, but if we get to a place where we can do it consciously, I think it brings more depth to our character, is changing our character's voice depending on mood and circumstance, right? So a character who has a lot of words, who uses massive amount of syllables, like think about like Gilmore Girls, Lorelai Gilmore, right? Like complex, fun, snarky, tons of dialogue, very snappy and witty all the time. And then there are these moments in that script where she goes quiet. And it happens when there's something very emotional happening for her character, or when she gets caught in something that she's embarrassed about. All of the witty like repartee stops.
Yeah.
And as a reader and as a viewer, we feel that change in dialogue in this really like powerful way for her emotionally. But for here with Sans, he's moved from being like boss man in charge who has a plan, who's walking this kid through this process, to now being the game show host. And so we want him to feel that. And we're also going to have a change in Harker here too, and we want the user to feel that. So we want their dialogue to change, and we want them to be different. So, and you did that with Sans. The reason I wanted to say all that is just to say, like, so we're getting a different Sans now. And originally you wrote, "Well played, sir. I'm proud to announce Brett Harker as our first contestant on the inaugural season of Minecraft. Mr. Harker is 25 years of age and a postgrad student at the University of California, San Diego." So with this, he keeps going, but with this introduction, we're getting this like great, like Price is Right type, you know, come on down. Like, it's so great. He's single and Southern California native who enjoys surfing, muscle cars, punk rock, and dangerous women, not necessarily in that order. Which is crazy that like Sans is now telling jokes.
Yeah.
It's so great, right? Like, it's really a great moment. And you can just visualize it in your head. This like businessman has now come to life when the cameras have come on, which is fantastic. So what I did was I took that paragraph and I thought like, okay, how can I make this sound even more Bob Barker game show hosty? So I added some pieces where he's addressing the audience directly.
Yes.
Right. And so welcome, the new paragraph reads, "Welcome everyone. Thanks for tuning in to our fantastic adventure." Right. And my goal with that in the dialogue is not just to build it up for this fictional audience that Sans is talking to, but also build it up for our reader. Right? Like, hey, we're about to take a huge trip. Right? Like Sans is pitching this moment to the audience, and now the reader has become the audience, right? So he's pitching it to the reader as well, which is something with dialogue I think we need to take in mind, because when two characters are talking to each other, they're actually not just talking to each other, they're talking to the reader too.
Right.
And so there's always this, like, we have this as a reader, we have this like omniscient ability to like see into everyone's mind in this way, and dialogue allows us to do that, because dialogue gives us the, like, it's not just about moving plot forward, it's about revealing the inner desires of characters and showing their personality and demonstrating, like we were talking about when we first started looking at the script, that like that character comes out in voice. Yes. Right? Like who the character is comes out in that voice. And so giving them the words that they need to display who they are. So, and acknowledging that the reader is that audience listening to what's going on. So all that, sorry, that was a rant. All that to say, I added that in with Sans and his talking directly to the audience. So welcome everyone. Thank you for turning into our fantastic adventure. I don't know about you, but I'm excited to get this show on the road. To kick us off, it's my pleasure to introduce our first contestant, Mr. Brett Harker, which I love that you did this here, that you made him a contestant, because it's as if he's like had a choice. Anyway, Mr. Harker is 25 years of age and a post-grad student at the University of California, San Diego. He's a single Southern California native who enjoys surfing, muscle cars, punk rock, and dangerous women, not necessarily in that order, which is such a great, like that ending line is, we talked about it already, but it's such a great hit. And then you had Harker saying, thanks, man, I'm so pumped to be here. And that's a hard change for Harker.
Yeah. Because
he's been so casual to now take on the persona of like a true Price is Right contestant, because that's what you want a Price is Right. Like, Bob, I'm so happy to be here. I love your show so much. Like, that's what you want a contestant to be. But Harker has been this like casual anti-authoritarian. The idea that he's going to change now is a rough shift. It's almost like he'd been mind wiped. So I cut out the thanks, man, and I take that, and I just made it really excited to be here.
Yep.
Right.
Cool.
And by the like the succinct nature of it, you can tell that like Harker doesn't actually care. And then, like he's kind of still has that realistic, like, you know, I was just tied to a chair a couple seconds ago.
Hey man, we I know you wanted to talk about the vulnerability of Harker.
Yeah.
And we might be coming up short on time.
Okay.
So I wonder if maybe we want to go to that part now.
Yeah, that's perfect. And sorry, you have to stop me, or I'll just
no. Sorry.
you have to, like, somebody get a hold of Jeff. The train's going down the track, and there's no stopping him. So yeah. So if we skip down a little bit more, there's this great line from Harker where Sans asks him, "Why are you here?" And originally you had my Gramps. He got cancer, and his bills are going to be crazy high. I'm doing this for him, right? Which is super revealing that like Harker has had some kind of choice in this, and that like, you know, he is an active participant. But it's also the first time that that Harker is revealing something about himself.
Yeah.
And so we want the reader to feel that that's difficult. And the way that we can do that is just by giving him a slower ramp in. Almost like he emotionally needs to build himself into it.
Yeah.
So I just changed it to, okay, sure, I guess. And you can see like just with those 4 words that Harker's like getting this like trudge into it. Like, okay, sure, I guess. Well, it's just that my Gramps. Right. And not a full sentence, because Harker's like emotionally processing now. So
taking everything for him to get these words out.
Yeah, it's like it's and there's also some hesitancy of like, do I actually want to say this? Like, am I actually about to say what's going on? So it's like a key pivotal moment for him, and it's great because it's just going to pull the reader right into Harker.
Yep.
Like it's going to suck them right in. So, okay, sure, I guess. Well, it's just that my Gramps, he got cancer. And keeping that sentence short and tight lands it heavy, right? He got cancer, and his bills are going to be crazy high. so I'm doing this for him. And like taking those short, again, like as we talked about at the front, those short, like machine gun sentences that just hammer home the emotion of the moment, right?
Yeah.
He got cancer. I'm doing this for him. And that's it. Yeah. So I think strategically using that like extra language, extra stuff can really help build out that emotional component.
Yeah.
To Parker.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all that to say, I loved reading the script. I think the characters are great. The power dynamic between them is amazing, and it's so crazy what you can get just out of dialogue, right? Like no
Yeah.
setting, anything. Yeah.
Yeah, and I learned so much from you, because even like, talking about the difference between using 2 words and 4 words, or truncating a sentence instead of using and, like, all of that matters when it comes down to the character.
Yeah. And if you like, I like to think about it as like, okay, I've got to build this beautiful cabinet and I only have a few tools. So like I worked as a blacksmith for a little bit, a long time ago in life, and we had this truck full of tools, and the guy I worked with always used to say like, right tool for the right job.
Yep.
Right. Like we have to have a whole truck of tools because we got to have the right tool for the right job. And it's the same with dialogue, right? Like we only have this brief moment to not just drive the plot forward, but also reveal everything about these characters and pull the reader in and like get the whole story engaged and get the words of our characters in the reader's mouths, right? Like it's this like, I'm going to take this person in and empathize in this deep way with the character. And so we got to use the right tools for the right job, right? Word structure, sentence structure, how many words, how few words, all of that matters. Yeah. So again, thanks for letting me do this. It's been,
that was incredibly helpful. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay.